Hi, today we're going to talk about 6 Days in Fallujah, the military tactical game that is based off of a real event that happened in the Iraq War, and the game is going to be released later this year, 2021. And I'm going to talk about how horrible this game is because, believe me, it is bad. The idea behind it is just so terrible and it's distasteful. But before I criticize the game, which I already did, we're going to get to know what actually happened in Fallujah, the true story of Fallujah. So without much further ado, let's talk about it. In 2003, the Iraq War started, and Al-Fallujah was not gravely affected by ground troops, rather it was a place of frequent airstrikes. And later on, the 82nd Airborne Division took place of Fallujah. They basically had the authority over Fallujah, they were patrolling Fallujah. The citizens felt discomfort, they felt that the troops did not respect Al-Fallujah. Al-Fallujah was known as a very religious city, and it was a city of mosques, basically. The troops did not respect Fallujah at all. The US commander of the troops claimed that they were sent to Fallujah to show presence, just so the average citizen would feel safe. We were given the authority to defend people and infrastructure, and obviously ourselves. Worried local leaders met with US commanders on April 24th, explaining that Al-Fallujah was a religious city and requesting sensitivity from US troops. Al-Fallujah residents resented the aggressive street patrols of the soldiers, they said. The same day, a crowd of 400 to 500 people protested the US military presence in nearby Al-Ramadi, Colonel Bray said. Someone threw a grenade on top of a Humvee, he told Human Rights Watch, injuring 2 US soldiers. In the following days, US convoys were often pelted with stones. In Fallujah, stories began to circulate about US soldiers inappropriately eyeing Iraqi women, a serious offense to the community. Rumors spread that soldiers were using night vision goggles to look at women as they hung clothes out to dry, or that soldiers were giving children bubblegum with pornographic pictures. Some people were apparently convinced that US troops were detaining children at the school. US soldiers did regularly survey the area around the school with binoculars and night vision equipment, a standard practice of perimeter security. Residents took this to be unduly invasive of their privacy. Soldiers also gave children candy, but Human Rights Watch saw no evidence of candy wrappers with pictures of women, let alone pornographic images. When you have strangers already intruding on your hometown, it's no surprise that the residents and the citizens would feel agitated and paranoid by your presence. Adding on to that, during the Iraq War, the US had control of a prison called Abu Ghraib. Basically, they were committing war crimes and human abuses in this prison. And it's really no surprise that Al-Fallujah citizens felt discomfort by US troops because of the stories that they heard that were happening in these prisons. The US was intruding on their homes. It was an invasion of Iraq, an illegal invasion. On the 28th of April 2003, an organized protest was held in Al-Fallujah demanding US troops to leave, which consequently ended with 17 citizens dead and 70 injured. Civilians say that the US shot at them unprovoked, while the US troops claimed that gunmen from the crowds were shooting at them first. No US casualties were reported. A Human Rights Watch report says that no bullet impacts were found at the school that the US soldiers were residing in, but multi-caliber bullet impacts were found on the opposite building of the school. 2 days later, 30th of April, Iraqi citizens demanded US soldiers to leave, and this time 3 Iraqi citizens were killed. And again, the US troops insist they were fired at first. Meanwhile, tension is growing between extremist factions and invading US troops and innocent Iraqi civilians. On March 31st, 2004, 4 Blackwater contractors were killed, burned, and later hung on a bridge by extremists. This agitated the US, and it later retaliated against the city of Fallujah. These string of events, especially the Blackwater deaths, led to the Second Battle of Fallujah, one of many war crimes the US had committed in Iraq. Right after the death of the Blackwater contractors, Mark Kimmett, then Brigadier General, announced that he will pacify the city of Fallujah. Brigadier General Mark Kimmett, a US Army spokesman, said, "We will be back in Fallujah. It will be at the time and place of our choosing. We will hunt down the criminal. Quite simply, we will respond," Kimmett said. "We are not going to do a pell-mell rush into the city. It's going to be deliberate, it will be precise, and it will be overwhelming," which was a fucking lie, first of all. "We will not rush in to make things worse." That was a lie. "We will plan our way through this, and we will re-establish control of that city, and we will pacify that city." During the whole month of April 2004, the US had been bombing Fallujah non-stop. And this, of course, destroyed people's houses and unfortunately killed civilians in the process. Which, by the way, the US did not even count the civilian deaths that they were causing in Iraq, because for them, they were not human enough to be counted. The bloodbath continued between the extremist factions and the invading US Marines. But also, innocent civilians felt the need to protect their city from the invading US Marines, which the US media branded them as terrorists and not civilians protecting their homes. And during this time, the US was committing war crimes in Fallujah by using white phosphorus on rebels, on civilians, and on children indiscriminately. And although white phosphorus is legal depending on its usage, it's internationally banned to use on people. White phosphorus is deadly and can burn through human skin and bone and cause excruciating death. The disproportionate standoff between the invading US Marines and the rebels lasted till the end of December 2004. The trail of death was felt by both sides of the battle, Iraqis having most of their loved ones killed. Iraqi civilians unfortunately paid the price of a war that they did not want to be a part of. This is said to have been the most gruesome and the most deadliest battle that took place in the Iraq War, with the US not leaving victorious, nor did they achieve anything conclusive in the aftermath, leaving the war-torn city of Fallujah to its traumatized citizens. 6 Days in Fallujah was set to be released in 2009, but it was cancelled due to British and American veterans and also anti-war groups being against the idea of this game. And after that, the original publisher, Konami, decided to drop the game. Here we are in 2021, and the game has risen back from the dead, and it's being worked on by a different game studio, and it will be released by a different publisher. Peter Tamte was the old CEO of the game studio that was working on the original 6 Days in Fallujah, and right now he's the CEO of the publishing company Victura, which he created himself. The announcement trailer for the game came out about a week ago from now, and well, let's watch it and see why it's so bad.
Saddam had been captured. The Iraqi army scattered.
First of all, the horrendous over-the-top accent that tries to pass as Arabic is fucking terrible. It's like an Americanized version of what an Arabic accent is supposed to be like. No Arab speaks English like that, and in fact, no Iraqis speak English like that. My Iraqi friend doesn't speak like that, and no Arab I met speaks like that. It's terrible. I'm not saying there's one type of Arabic accent when you're speaking English. Different regions of the Middle East and different Arabic countries have their own accent, but this is not it. This is just not it. This is what an Arabic accent is supposed to be like.
If you don't have the perfect English and you didn't take the English class with Saeed in grade 3, please don't bother, okay?
Real life footage of the Iraqi war is so fucking distasteful and disrespectful.
Lawlessness and fear gave Az-Zarqawi his moment, and he was prepared. They seized Fallujah, and the city was the first to suffer under their black banner.
These terrorists were armed to the teeth. No one will fight against them.
It had to be stopped.
Here they don't even give a reason as to why there are extremist groups in the first place. And the reason being that the US is occupying their homes. And of course, after having your home demolished and your loved ones killed in battle, it motivates you more to go and get revenge and therefore joining rebel groups. It doesn't follow their narrative, which they're trying to portray, which is America good and Muslim bad. The Iraqi war is more complex than they'd like to believe. The war is not all black and white as they try to paint it. You know, the American soldiers were sent to their deaths unnecessarily, and Iraqis had to suffer the most.
It was a fortress. It was a well-prepared city, buttressed, waiting for us to come.
Literally, no one wanted you to come, and no one wanted you there.
The only way you can clear a city is you have to search every house, you have to search every room, and you have to root out every insurgent.
It's unfortunate that the innocent Iraqi people were rooted with the extremist groups. The US did announce that they would be attacking Fallujah 3 days prior, and they also dropped millions of leaflets saying that men from the age of 12 and up will be considered hostile and they will be killed on sight. But also, women and children were not even allowed to leave the city because it was blockaded, and US troops were discriminating against everyone, and basically no one was allowed to leave the city as they'd like you to believe. Recreated by the ones who are there, except for Iraqi citizens that are living with the horror trauma of the war, and now they'll get to relive the experience through a game.
We can tell you our stories. We can show you our scars. But some moments must be experienced.
No, they do not. Okay, so we're gonna go through some interviews with Peter Tamte and some other people, and we'll see what they say about the game. The first interview we're going to look at is the one with Peter Tamte, the CEO of Victura, the one he did with Polygon. Those looking for a critical perspective on the Iraq war should steer clear of 6 Days in Fallujah. The controversial first-person shooter seeks to portray one of the bloodiest battles in American history, one that cost the lives of United States and Allied forces, as well as thousands of Iraqi citizens in 2004. The problem with this sentence is that it says as well as Iraqi citizens, and when you put as well as, it makes me feel as if Iraqi citizens' lives are not emphasized enough, which they should be, and that they are secondary to the Allied forces and the United States soldiers. You know, it's crazy that they're regarded as secondary, or at least this is what the sentence is making me feel. The wording here is not great because why are you emphasizing the intruders' lives when the innocent lives that were lost were Iraqi lives? Originally announced in 2009, the game was dropped by Konami due to the objections of the families of service members killed during the Iraq War. In the 12 years since, public opinion has demonstrably shifted against that war. Thanks to the objections of the veterans' families that the game was not released back then, you know, it's disrespectful to them, but it's also disrespectful to the Iraqi lives that were lost. And if the families had not objected, and if Iraqis came forth and said that this game is disrespectful to them, you know, the game would have just been released anyways. That makes the job of Peter Tamte, head of 6 Days in Fallujah, publisher Victura, perhaps harder today than it was more than a decade ago. In an interview with Polygon on Thursday, after the game was announced for a second time, he was insistent that the developer Highwire Games will not grapple with political machinations that led to the titular conflict. When you don't even want to talk about the politics that led to the illegal war, you know, it doesn't make it believable that you want to show the true story of Fallujah. I mean, I know it's not going to be the whole truth because when did the truth ever help anyone? Come on. Instead, their first-person shooter will try to engender empathy for American troops in the field for their work destroying the insurgents that dug in throughout Fallujah, and for the civilians trapped in between. I mean, this sentence is just so conflicting because what? Like what? I really don't get it. You want to engender empathy for the illegal occupation and intrusion by the American forces and the coalition, and, you know, just forget the innocent Iraqi citizens. You know, this sentence just tells you everything about the game. It's just another war propaganda to show that the American heroes coming to liberate the barbarians of the Middle East and they're coming to free us of our oppressors, which, in this case, it's not true at all, and in most cases also in history, the US has always been the oppressor. And the use of insurgents here is incorrect because Iraqis are not subjects of the United States. I think reasonable people can disagree with that, he told Polygon of his narrative strategy. For us as a team, it is really about helping players understand the complexity of urban combat. It's about the experiences of that individual that is now there because of political decisions, and we do not want to show how choices that are made by policymakers affect the choices that a Marine needs to make on the battlefield. Just as that Marine cannot second guess the choices by the policymakers, we're not trying to make a political commentary about whether or not the war itself was a good or a bad idea. If you wanted people to understand the complexity of urban combat, maybe make another game, because this is just so distasteful. What this paragraph is also telling me is that he's pardoning the war crimes that the Marines had committed in Fallujah, even if no one outside of Iraq, the policymakers that he's talking of, had any say in, which they probably also did, but also the Marines had choices to make, their own choices, and their own choices was to commit war crimes. And is he going to show the war crimes that the Marines committed? I don't think so. And then when he says, we're not trying to make a political commentary about whether or not the war itself was a good or bad idea. What? Like, there is no good or bad idea. It was a bad idea. Like, there is no discussion for the Iraq war. It was a bad idea, first of all. It's the kind of dodge that we've heard from game makers many times before, most recently from Ubisoft in the lead up to Tom Clancy's The Division 2. But that game's conflict was a wholly fictional one. 6 Days in Fallujah recalls a battle that still looms large in the rear-view mirror of our country's headlong push into the Middle East, a tragic event seemingly on the cusp between current events and modern history. Its main characters will be real Marines and soldiers who fought there. Peter Tamte said that Iraqi civilians also helped make this game, which I don't believe for 1 second. I don't buy it because it's bullshit. The city of Fallujah became a hotbed of insurgent activity during the 2003 Iraq War. A terrorist named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi drew fighters to that city from around the country and beyond. The violence he inspired directly caused thousands of civilian casualties, but also resulted in the deaths of a team of private military contractors from Blackwater, USA. The image of their burned and mutilated corpses hanging from a bridge became synonymous with the US occupation of the country itself. In 2004, Western forces tried to retake the city not once but twice. 6 Days in Fallujah focuses on the Second Battle of Fallujah, which cost around 100 American lives, and according to the International Red Cross, the lives of at least 800 civilians. And basically in this paragraph it only blames the extremist groups that were killing the civilians and not the US Marines, who are also participating in the killing of the civilians. Looking back on the reasons for the Iraq War itself, many rightly question whether the US military should have been there at all. Did the administration of President George W. Bush mislead the American people and the world in the months before the March 2003 invasion? Was the so-called coalition of the willing duped or otherwise incentivized into following along? Tamte isn't interested in those questions. Peter Tamte is not interested in the truth. He's just interested in making money. He's interested in making money and in making propaganda and whitewashing history. He doesn't care about the countless deaths that the US has caused in Iraq. He cares about the American heroes saving the people of Fallujah, which is just a bullshit story. He's also not interested in showing the atrocities committed there. First of all, there is proof of the war crimes that the United States had committed in Iraq. Even veterans themselves came out and said, well, look, we're doing illegal things here and we're using illegal chemical weapons, and so I don't understand why it says alleged atrocities when there is proof of these atrocities being committed. When we describe first-person shooter as tactical, what we're often talking about is methods of movement. Where does the player go? How quickly and with what posture? But a military shooter likewise focuses on the weapon systems that are given to the player. For Marines and soldiers in Fallujah, that means rifles and explosives. But there were other tools and other tactics in play during that battle in 2004. The US military has said that it used shake and bake tactics, a combination of high explosive and white phosphorus rounds that flushed out insurgents from their hardened bunkers in order to destroy them. But using white phosphorus as a weapon and in close proximity to civilians would seem to contravene the accepted laws of war. Again, Tamte isn't interested in litigating what constitutes a war crime. There are things that divide us, and include those really divisive things. I think distracts people from the human stories that we can all identify with. I have two concerns with including phosphorus as a weapon. Number one is that it's not part of the stories that these guys told us, so I don't have an authentic, factual basis on which to tell that. Number two is I don't want sensational type of things to distract from the parts of that experience. How is it distracting if you put white phosphorus in the game, which actually happened and is a war crime? Like, you wanted to tell the truth? Well, here's the truth. This is the truth of the war crimes that were committed. So I don't understand how that's distracting. You're just telling the story as it is. But of course we know that you don't want to tell the story. And he says the veterans don't want to talk about the white phosphorus. They don't want to talk about the human atrocities they committed in Fallujah. Well, of course they won't talk about it, because they want to seem like the good guys. They're the good guys and they're attacking the bad guys in Fallujah. It's all a one-sided story, and it's all propaganda and whitewashing of history. The same is true of the depleted uranium munitions used during the battle. The super dense shells commonly associated with the tank-busting A-10 Warthog can fragment and shatter on impact, scattering their heavy metal payload all around. That could be why researchers show an increased incidence of cancers among the current population of Fallujah, especially in children. We asked Tamte what responsibility his team bears in communicating that outcome of the second battle of Fallujah to consumers. I don't think players are going to be confused about the cost of war, Tamte said. I just don't think that they're going to walk away from this experience going, we need more war. I don't think that's something that the Marines and soldiers want as a message. I don't think that's something that the Iraqi civilians want as a message. I think people do need to understand the human cost of war. Okay, so he has no right to dictate what Iraqi civilians want. If he truly cared what Iraqi civilians who suffer from this war till this day, he would not be making this game. Or if he was making this game, he would work with more Iraqi civilians and what the war meant to them, and the outcomes of war and how it affects them today. And he's not interested in that. So why is he talking about Iraqi civilians like he knows what they want? It's stupid. Tamte continued, perhaps playing the game will make them curious and they'll want to learn more about all the things that have happened in Fallujah since the 2004 battle, and that will lead them to their own conclusions from doing their research. But right now, simply ignoring the battle is not going to cause them to think about all of its consequences. In my opinion, it's difficult to retell history accurately in a game because developers are limited to their resources and on the development time that they have and whatever. And also, especially in a biased game like this, I don't even remember a time where I played a war game and I thought, I want to learn more history. And games like this is targeted mostly at impressionable children and teenagers. They'll take the game story as at face value, and they probably won't do further research. This game is just for an adrenaline rush. It doesn't want to tell a story. Well, it does want to tell a story, but a really biased one. In making 6 Days in Fallujah, Tamte and his team interviewed Marines and soldiers who fought there, just months after the battle was over, then again as recently as last year. There will be the avatars that players fight alongside. The challenge of moving house to house, engage in some of the most violent urban combat since Vietnam, will make up 90% of the game's action. The other 10%, Tamte said, will be given over to the story of the city's civilian population. Tamte sure is a charitable person for giving 10% of the story to the Iraqi civilians who suffered the most in the Iraq war. Working with an American journalist in Iraq, whose name is being withheld for their safety, according to Tamte. Developer Highwire Games has interviewed dozens of civilians who lived through the fighting. Their stories will give the game its parallel storyline, where players will take on the role of the father trying to lead his family to safety. That family story will overlap with the US forces in the game. This is an unarmed Iraqi civilian, Tamte stressed. We do not at any point ask the player to become an insurgent, to be clear about that. This is an Iraqi civilian who was trying to get his family out of the city during the battle. Well, that's just great. Will he also show how the US troops did not allow people from the age of 12 to leave the city because they were considered hostile and they were shot on sight? They were given orders to shoot them on sight. And here he says, we do not at any point ask the player to become an insurgent. So it's okay to be a US soldier killing civilians, which I'm sure they won't show in the game, but a US soldier killing civilians is okay. Being on the opposite side is not. That's confusing. Of course, this isn't the first time that Tamte has tried to get this game made. He says he's been working on it for over 15 years, effectively since the months after the Second Battle of Fallujah ended. What hung him up last time wasn't the outcry over alleged war crimes. Instead, it was a coalition of a different sort. This one made up of the families of service members who died in the Iraq War. Their outrage became a talking point for the international media and ultimately helped pressure Konami into dropping the game in 2009. One of the other dodges that many military-inspired games make is that they fictionalize their setting. These are made-up soldiers and made-up marines, developers say, fighting a battle in a made-up country. Tamte and the team at Highwire Games are going into a different direction by putting real people into their game. So what does Tamte have to say to those families, once again outraged that their relatives' death is included even peripherally in this way? A message that I heard from all of the people who've lost loved ones in the battle is they don't want their child or friend's sacrifice to be forgotten, Tamte said. Even the ones who were very opposed to the Iraq War, and I had conversations with many of them, as well as other members of our team, especially former military who are on our team, had conversations with many of these families in 2009, and we heard one after the other. We don't want you to make a game about this, but we don't want our son's sacrifice to be forgotten. It's a mixture of that. The reality is that most people are not aware of the battle for Fallujah, Tamte continued, and so by talking about this battle in a game, we are helping people remember the sacrifice of some very specific people. So that's number one. We share the same objective they have, which is we don't want their son's sacrifice to be forgotten. But do I understand their caution about it? Absolutely. Because for most of these people, their only idea of a video game is watching somebody else play Call of Duty. Call of Duty is a sport, and if somebody made a sport out of the killing of my son, I'd be pretty upset. Our job now is to show people that we're not making Call of Duty. So it's okay to kill Iraqi people's sons and daughters, but it's not okay to kill American people's sons and daughters. You know, how about we don't kill any of them and not make a game about a real event where people lost their loved ones, their families, their sons and daughters on both sides. And this is just very insensitive, and just how could you forget about the Iraqi people? I mean, this is just another Muslim killing simulator. It's dumb. And what about the people of Fallujah? Once known as the city of mosques, Fallujah had more than 60 of its 200 historic structures destroyed in the fighting. Tens of thousands of people fled the city, many never to return. Lives were lost and communities were shattered forever. What does Tamte say to those outraged that their suffering is being put into this game? Almost all the outrage I've heard are from people who are not in Fallujah, Tamte said. I think we live in a culture where we feel the responsibility to defend people, whether they want to be defended or not, on social media. And I am sure that there are people who are in Fallujah who will be offended. But I will tell you that from my experience and conversation that I've had for over 15 years on this project, nearly all want people to know what happened in Fallujah, whether you are an Iraqi civilian or are a member of the coalition, either side. And here again, he's talking for the Iraqi citizens, and he also undermines the Iraqi citizens who were not even in Fallujah but were also affected by the war. That's very insensitive of him. He undermines their suffering in order to achieve his agenda, which is this really shitty game. And like when he says nearly everybody wants to know about Fallujah, I think the Iraqi people have had enough of knowing about Fallujah, because they of course know what happened in Fallujah. Why would they want their stories to be told in a video game that portrays them as the enemy. For Tamte, the goal of 6 Days in Fallujah is to celebrate the heroism of those coalition forces who fought there. The goal is to empathize with them and also the civilians trapped in the city. Anything else is a distraction. The only thing that I fear is that fundamentally when we cut through everything, people's objection here to 6 Days in Fallujah is more of an objection to the Iraq War, Tamte said. We've made games about other wars and real stories from other wars that have not gotten the attention and have not gotten any sort of controversy. So fundamentally, people's objection is to the Iraq War. I don't think we should be a proxy for that particular battle. First of all, Fallujah is part of the Iraq War, and when you say people are objecting against this game because they object to the Iraq War, then yeah, you're right. Because the Iraq War was an inherently illegal and a bad thing that happened. The game he describes, however, seems to have a very narrow appeal. Are you interested in the nuts and bolts of clearing a room filled with deadly insurgents? Then step on up and prepare to get your heart torn out. One way or another, Tamte and his team are eager to hold your hand and guide you through that experience. But if you're curious why you and your virtual comrades are there in the first place, you'll need to take that step on your own. You know what? I don't think I want Tamte and his team holding my hand, because especially how he wants to portray this game and how he sees Iraqi lives as secondary. Now that we finished from that interview, let's read some old quotes and see what's going on. We can't tell the story without telling the rest of it. We have to give players the context for why they're in the city, why this battle exists. Victoria CEO Peter Tamte explains. We're not asking players to commit atrocities in the game. Are we effectively sanitizing events by not doing that? I don't think that we need to portray the atrocities in order for people to understand the human cost. We can do that without the atrocities. In the same interview, Tamte explains how he'll be omitting some pretty key context with 6 Days in Fallujah. First of all, he says he wants to show the truthful story. And then he says he doesn't want to show some of the story. So he's contradicting himself. And this whole thing is just like, we're not asking players to commit atrocities. We're just asking players to kill some Iraqi Muslims. That's all. Yeah, because that's so much better, isn't it, Tamte? Best-selling author and former SAS soldier Andy MacLeod, however, defended 6 Days in Fallujah. War, he said, has been peddled as entertainment by the media for years. Furthermore, he argued that the UK does not understand the Fallujah conflict in the same way as the Americans, a nation that lost more soldiers in Fallujah than the whole of the British Army has in Iraq and Afghanistan combined. So if having the highest body count justifies whether this game should be made or not, then shouldn't the Iraqi people have the ultimate say if this game should be published or not? And I'm sure they would be opposed to its publication. And using his arguments against him, he does not understand the Fallujah War as Iraqis do. People who lost more civilians, more innocent lives than the British and American have. I mean, the game won't even value the Iraqi citizens, the innocent lives that were lost. For the Americans, they have a personality, they have an identity, they're a human being that you sympathize with. But for the Iraqi civilians, the innocent lives, they're just the Muslim terrorists, a scarfed brown entity that you have to exterminate in order to save humanity. Exterminate the savages and put the heroes on a pedestal. And you know, Arab blood is cheap for basically Hollywood and the video games industry in America. We're portrayed as violent savages, and just like as this book by Jack Shaheen, he extensively talks about how Hollywood portrays Muslims and Arabs in these stereotypes, really shitty stereotypes, that we're always terrorists and we're always vilified as a people. And some games that I can think of right now that vilifies Muslims are CSGO, Modern Warfare 1, Modern Warfare 3, Modern Warfare 2019, basically Call of Duty games. And what's interesting is that not only Arabs are portrayed as terrorists, but also Russians. So I guess only Arabs and Russians are terrorists in this world, and, you know, America's the good guy, coming to save our land and shit. You know, war games are fine. I love war games. But when you base it off a real event, where people are trying to forget what happened. Well, at least Americans are trying to forget what happened, whereas the Iraqis have to live with the consequences and the aftermath of the destruction that the US committed in Iraq. I'm not Iraqi, but as an Arab, I have the responsibility to call out bullshit like this. And the conversation has always been the American point of view and what Americans think. Arab voices are basically drowned out from the media. From the whole conversation about this game, whether it's good or bad, like that's up for discussion or something. I'll link to the thoughts of other Arabs about this game and why Peter Tamte and 6 Days in Fallujah are colossal trash. I'll link everything down in the description, so be sure to check it out. Thank you for watching, and consider subscribing and liking this video and commenting your thoughts. And especially if you're from Iraq, I would love to hear your thoughts on the game, because your input is very valuable for me. And I'd love to know what you guys think. Please do your own research about the Iraq War and the battles that happened in Fallujah, because I did not go in depth. And as you do your own research, you'll understand the war crimes that the US committed there and the coalition forces. And you'll understand even more why this game is so bad. Thank you for watching, and have a nice day.